not a very easy act for the dull, straightforward Englishman, which is me, to follow the lively, dynamic American, which Hawaiian, which was Richard. So I really guess it would have been ideal if they'd put the presentations the other way round. But there you are. Now you can do your intercultural comparisons, and you have a little taste of everything here. Now, I guess in a way, well, with these true-false questions, I always kept on thinking it depends, you know. And in a way, sort of, that's the way life is all the time, really. And it's getting more and more like that, really, with all these post this, post that, with globalization coming, and we're getting influences from everywhere, and we're postmodern, so we don't have the rules of modernity, and we're post-method, so we don't have any methods anymore. And so we're all kind of splashing around and trying to find our way. But we can't really splash around, because if we really splashed around, we'd just jump at random from one spot to another. So we have to have some kinds of principles around us. So what I've been trying to think for myself is, in this life that follows the so-called communicative revolution, when we felt everything was so straightforward, I suppose in a way that was the modern era at the time, when communicative language teaching first came in, it came in as a kind of package of ideas and techniques which you could get in all different handbooks. It was sort of regarded at the time as being top quality, ready for export. I remember going to seminars myself. I remember particularly one at the University of Reading, where there really was no doubt this was the thing which would replace everything, you know. And there was a sort of transmission-oriented attitude towards it. It was ready to go everywhere. No questions asked, you just transmit it. And people who were not teaching communicatively, well, there was something they hadn't quite misunderstood. Nothing wrong with the communicative aspect of it, just people hadn't really sort of misunderstood it, had not really understood it so well. But later on, this post-method questioning came in for various reasons, including globalization, the influence of globalization that I've just been mentioning, you know, getting away from this idea that there were ready answers and that the center sort of radiates things to the periphery and all that kind of thing. And with many countries in Asia taking over this communicative approach, finding various things that did not really work. I put one or two examples in the paper, which is in the booklet. One or two things that did not really work. And so the whole thing sort of coming up for questioning as a kind of thing that needs to be rethought out. And so the earlier ideas about communicative language teaching as a sort of package has very much given way to a much broader kind of set of general ideas, really, which are really so general, as Jack Richards says in one of his recent little books called Communicative Language Teaching. Many of the ideas that are now connected with a communicative approach are really just common sense ideas that anybody in language teaching would say, oh yes, that's a good idea. And many of the sort of core ideas have been questioned. And it's much more a sort of, I think of it as a kind of landscape on which one can sort of talk about various things which are needed in order to take people in various directions. And here's an article by a Vietnamese teacher who sort of sums up a kind of basic view of it, that really when you clear all the different interpretations away, the basic interpretation really comes down to one or two basic principles, like learning is likely to happen when classroom practices are made real and meaningful to students, to learners. So very basic sort of thing. And our aim is to teach learners to be able to use the language effectively for their own communicative needs. These are really very general kinds of principles, and all the other sorts of things are often being questioned. So, and with the post-method approach, each teacher is being said, based on principles, you sort of devise your own way of getting in these particular directions. But we need some kind of conceptual framework for knowing where we're going, otherwise things will just become sort of random. And we've had various suggestions. The Kumara, this is a challenge. Kumara, fortunately, if you see him, he says you could call me Kumar. But the gentleman whose name is Kumara Divulu, you know, he has his macro strategies, which he proposes to teachers as sort of basic principles which they should put into operation in ways which suit their own context a sort of contextualized way of developing techniques based upon certain principles which are effective. And others have suggested others. I'm suggesting a framework of 3 basic principles, really, which I think sort of are kind of core to the sorts of things where we need to sort of make sure that language teaching develops these things. And one is this sort of form to meaning connections, the idea that we have to produce contexts in which people can relate forms to meanings. So focus on form is still necessary, but the relationship with meanings, we cannot forget the relationship with meanings. Nothing is worth anything unless we give motivation, investment. They have to invest students have to invest themselves in whatever they're doing. And because it's getting people to use language for communication, the third dimension, interaction and communication, is another, if you like, non-negotiable dimension, which we can say, as teachers, we have to ensure that those are there somewhere. Incidentally, most of what I say will seem to be oriented towards oral language. I tend to think of that more often than reading and writing, but the general principles can actually be applied by extension to other areas as well. So if we look at the first one, the form to meaning connections, you know, quite often in different contexts, people have worked with a kind of dichotomy of exercises and tasks, as if tasks, I think many countries have got that. I think you've got the discussion about tasks, well, I know you have, in Korea. And the tendency seems to be that we have tasks there where people focus on meaning, communicating, and we have exercises where people focus on the discrete items which are needed in order to do these various things. Now, I've always found that dichotomy impossible to work with, really, because there are so many things in between, so many things where you say, is that an exercise or a task, etc. That I'm not the only one there. Many practicing teachers find exactly the same, that they keep on asking. They say, I don't know whether it's a task. I'm doing this, but I don't know if it's a task. And with inspectors looking down there over their shoulder, they're sometimes worried, is this a task or not a task? So my own approach is to have a sort of continuum, a communicative continuum for viewing this area of connecting forms with meanings. And I put it there on the... It's in the booklet there. Incidentally, when this is finished, I'll give you, if you want, the actual slides are on another handout here. But I'll give them to anybody who wants them at the end. You can have them. So for that particular dimension of language teaching, I work with a sort of continuum from non-communicative learning at the one end, where you have total focus on the forms, not necessarily any attention at that point to meaning at all. It could be pronunciation practice, things like that, when to put an S on the end of verbs, things like that. To, at the other extreme, authentic communication, where the total focus is on meanings, the communication of meanings, which are by definition unpredictable because you don't know what is going to come up. But then in between, you have these different gradings, if you like, so that next to non-communicative learning, you have pre-communicative practice. I always forget that if I point at this, you can't see it. So I have to use the cursor. You have pre-communicative language practice, where you are focusing on meanings, but you're not actually communicating anything with it. The typical sort of question and answer practice. Communicative language practice, where you are communicating with the language, but basically it's more with pre-selected forms, so that you have taught something and they use it in order to do an information task, in order to do a survey, in order to do something like that. So there's a kind of... It's sort of exactly in halfway between what you could call tasks and what you could call exercises, where they're communicating with pre-taught language, but they're focusing on meanings as well. Structured communication, where you are now getting them to create their own meanings, but you have controlled it through structuring the situation in such a way that you know that they have the language in order to cope with it all. And then at the other end, authentic communication, where you really don't know what meanings are going to come up, a discussion or something like that about a difficult topic perhaps, where you really don't know what's going to come up. And some teachers have used this as a kind of basis. A couple of PhD students have used this as a basis for analysing teachers' practice in schools. And they found that on the whole, teachers move from there to there to there. Most teachers in their day-to-day practice don't get any further than communicative language practice, so they don't go over into these other two boxes, but this, for many teachers, can serve as a kind of basis that they can extend their activities, their repertoire from there to there to there. In there, they can gradually move into there and later into there. So that this sort of continuum is often found a more useful kind of basis for extending this dimension of forms to meanings, because usually nearly everybody agrees now that focus on form is necessary, and that the danger is that we tend then to separate out form and teach it as if it had no relation to meaning, as if it was just there for its own sake. So this kind of continuum is one way in which at the moment I sort of picture this particular dimension of language teaching which has to be taken care of. The second one, it's no good, whatever kind of focus you have, whether on form or meaning, if the students are not involved in it, if there's no involvement in the task, by the way, when I say the word task, I include things here as tasks. I mean, I don't believe in the sort of dichotomy of tasks and exercises. All of these are learning tasks. It's provided people are doing things in order to further learning. To me, they are all tasks, even if they're focusing on form. That's just I just find it easier to think that way, because then you can talk about different types of tasks. So, whatever the nature of the task, it's no use whatsoever unless there's investment, unless there's motivation or involvement, call it what you like. They all come down to the same thing, that the mind engagement, Prabhu, in his book 1987, way back, he had what I think is a really useful little term, mind engagement, as the key aspect that has to be catered for in language teaching. And a lot of thinking, a lot of it connected with a gentleman called Dornay here, has gone recently into what are these basic dimensions of motivation that have got to be looked into. And the basic motivating environment of learning is something where we have to give our conscious attention to it. Many students themselves in various surveys have emphasized what a lot of attention they themselves pay to the actual environment in which they learn. A harmonious environment, one which is purposeful, all sorts of things like this are really key in the learning attitudes of students. Group norms which support effort and learning. One of the drawbacks of much language teaching in Britain, people say, where on the whole students don't want to learn French and German, is that very quickly sometimes group norms evolve, which are the opposite of this. Sort of the group norm is that you're a bit unusual if you really try hard to speak French. And so, to get rid of that sort of attitude and build more constructive ones is one to which teachers have to give their effort. And each student having a role where they seem to be part of a learning community. The notion of learning community, setting up a learning community is a key one, I think, where students really feel that it's not the teacher and the taught, but everybody together learning. And if one can create that, then that's wonderful. And of course, quite important is the teacher's leadership style, a style which is not authoritative, but also not laissez-faire, but sort of democratic and facilitative, and which allows the students to learn in ways that are themselves, but with plenty of guidance. And then, as well as the basic environment, the actual motivational strategies that teachers can use. And again, if you look in Dornay's book of 2001, he gives some useful ideas on these three main areas. Generating the initial motivation, and it's here that all these various things like instrumental motivation, integrative motivation, expectancy of success, attitudes to the language, they all play a role here, but the teacher can, of course, influence these by the way that he or she presents the language and the need for it, etc. But then, even more important maybe, or certainly equally important, maintaining the motivation once it's there, through ways such as giving students a sense of success, a feeling that they are esteemed, that they are respected as people, that they have sort of choices in what they do. And then afterwards, after classes, etc., encouraging positive self-evaluation so that they feel that they have done well, etc. This was a key issue, in some of the French teaching in Britain, which is, is actually more similar to teaching English in many countries than teaching English in, say, America, really, because you have students who are not really motivated. But one of the key things was key areas of thought went into thinking out how can we devise courses so that students have a feeling of success at the end of it and they feel they've really learned something. They're not focused on what they could not do, because earlier courses were total failure with many students because the whole focus was on things they could not do, things like being accurate with the language, but changing it so that the focus is on things they could do, like expressing meanings with language and things like that. Then a third area with this dimension of motivation, one which I've just started looking into myself, really, and I'd like to develop thinking about it a little bit more, because this is a whole notion of self-regulation seems to me quite key. The self-regulation is a sort of continuum from totally extrinsic motivation, which would be up here, to totally intrinsic motivation, which would be down here, but points which are along the way, and points where the teacher can sort of encourage a kind of movement towards intrinsic motivation, or self-regulation, if you like, where whatever the student is doing, he or she is involved in it and doing it for himself or herself. Again, which really is a sort of basic requirement for learning, really, because it has to be the student's own mind that is involved in it, rather than being involved in it because somebody else has told me to, as it so often is. And this continuum, again, from external regulation, these are examples from a couple of the key people, Deci and Ryan, or Ryan and Deci. Sometimes it's Deci and Ryan, and sometimes it's Ryan and Deci, and you forget who. But, going from the totally extrinsic motivation, external regulation, where they say, I try to do well because I'll get into trouble if I don't. So there's no real involvement as such in the task. I'll get into trouble if I don't. Gradually moving inwards. So this is important. It's not a sort of either they're extrinsic or they're intrinsic, but there's a kind of gradual moving inwards of the process of regulation. To introjected regulation, I try to do well because I'll feel really bad about myself if I don't. So it's moving into the feelings, but it's still not really I'm doing this because I really think it's worth doing. It's maybe somebody else has made it that I'll feel bad. Maybe my parents have told me. And if I don't do it well, my parents will make me feel bad. So it's introjected, it's going inside. Identified, where the reasons for it, actually the person becomes identified with those reasons. I try to do well because it's important for me to try. So the student has taken that importance into himself or herself. And therefore, it's moving along this extrinsic to intrinsic scale. And then integrated regulation, I try to do well because I enjoy doing my schoolwork well, the point where the desire to do it really becomes internalized, and so you can talk about self-regulation and intrinsic motivation. And the teacher can actually do various things. I referred to an article, quite a recent article by I've forgotten the name, but it's in the new journal called Innovation in Language Learning and Teaching. You can get it on the internet. You can get it. Where it's quite interesting, where he gives examples from practical teaching, how teachers can actually provide a sort of support which helps students to go down this particular sort of key dimension of motivation, so that things become self-regulation. And of course, when it becomes self-regulation, then of course that also ties in a little bit with the end of that communicative continuum, because self-regulation means their own thoughts, their own feelings, expressing their own meanings in things like authentic communication. So you could actually kind of produce a complicated model where you actually sort of link in those different things, because they're all related. And this is from Deci and Ryan themselves. They argue with various references to research that the three main things which help students to move through this sort of continuum of regulation: feelings of autonomy, the feeling that they're making personal choices. So again, the teacher can do that in little ways, starting with little choices. No good giving them lots and lots of choices straight off, because the students can't cope with suddenly having hundreds of choices. It's like, so if somebody says to me in Seoul, right, which restaurant do you want to eat at tonight? I have no idea, because I don't know any restaurants to eat at. Really, I don't have enough knowledge. So, so the choices have to be sort of graded, if you like. But this dimension of gradually giving choices and increasing the choices is an important one of giving feelings of autonomy. Feeling of the second condition, they say, is a feeling of competence, the feeling of giving them tasks which are appropriate to their level and constructive feedback. So competence and relatedness, a sense of community with others, they argue from research that these three things are things which teachers can try to address in order to help students to move along that continuum. Okay, so that's we got the form, sort of the form to meaning continuum, where we can consciously sort of address that in teaching and sort of move around different areas of it. It's not that, sort of one year we're all on focusing on form, next year we're all going to be on focus on meaning. Not at all. It's a dimension which you can sort of manipulate for different purposes. How to manipulate it, of course, is very difficult, because actually right on there I put at the top here analytic strategies and experiential strategies, because that is a sort of key sort of difference as far as teachers are concerned. They are going to be appropriate all the way through teaching, and they're going to and they're going to and they're always going to play a role. But which one plays a role and when not, that is really something where nobody can give you the answer, because this is where the teacher's art, based on understanding of principles and things like that, obviously, and experience, comes about. But those two things, that again is, from analytic to experiential teaching, analytic teaching separate bits, which tends to be pre-communicative type, experiential, learning through experience, is a sort of major area which we have to negotiate. But the other one then, let's say because we're teaching language in order for people to communicate, the last dimension, the third one, I put as interaction, because we have to give attention to types of interaction. And getting interaction in the classroom is difficult, actually, sometimes. I've noticed very, very often myself, I've drawn a lot on cooperative learning literature for a lot of the techniques I use in my own classes and that. Because I notice so often that if you give group work, you want to give group work so that they interact with each other, but then you find that one person is doing all the work. The rest of them are not interacting at all. So really, I mean, if one person is doing, if two people are doing all the work, at least they are using the language to interact with each other. But the other three in the group, actually it's a waste of time for them. And we can't just say, oh, well, that's their own fault, because it's our job to teach them all. So to find different ways of structuring the interaction within the class so that everybody has got to play some kind of positive role. This connects with the idea of having a positive role in the classroom, of course, in which they need to contribute and they need to communicate. The principle of positive interdependence is one which underlies cooperative learning techniques. And I just put here the names of some of the ones. You can follow them up in the literature. But on this dimension of interaction, I find that a very useful dimension which we can think about. Using different techniques such as jigsaw, expert jigsaw, snowball, think, pair, share. I haven't got time to go into what all these things are, but I'm sure a lot of them you know already. If you want to send an email, if you want to find out more, you can send me an email. I can send a little handout with them all on. Three-step interview, rotating circles. All of these are different ways of structuring the interaction to try to ensure that, having tried to control this form to meaning dimension, having tried to get a kind of motivation, we now create contexts in which people actually need to interact with each other in order to express meaning. So those for me are the three dimensions which I regard as kind of basic to any sort of approach for the teacher to, whatever techniques the teacher uses for them, to try to address control. I put them in the form of a cube. Now, that is the very, very first time that I have actually managed to create a cube on a PowerPoint. It might be the very last time. You'll never know. But I put them in a kind of cube. That one dimension then is the form to meaning connections. Moving, whatever they are, you've got to have the motivation, the investment. So far, we want to get up to here, basically. Well, actually, I see the motivation one as the top, as the most important one, really. The once you've got that, you can actually move along there till they gradually not only get the forms, but also relate them to meanings. And that because we're teaching language so that they can communicate with us, they are also simultaneously, these are all simultaneously, that's why it seemed worthwhile making a cube. So that simultaneously, that's right, you're also sort of moving along this communication interaction dimension so that the interaction becomes more and more necessary. So there we are then, that's my little offering for the world, and at least that's colourful. The cube is colourful. Thank you for appreciating the cube. Thank you very much. So with those three things, then I always have to think up some kind of lively finishing line, and I never can. Yeah, there we are. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.